Hi, everybody, and welcome to another Biotensegrity party. I'm Susan Lowell Desolorcino in Washington, D.C., one of the last colonies of the United States of America. Graham, where are you today?
Nottingham, UK. It's nice, bright sunshine here.
Oh, nice. And Chris Clancy is trying to get in, but we're having technical problems. But we want to thank everyone for being here. And we want to welcome Mr. Leonid Blyum, who's going to give us an opening toast.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, am I correct that this is our return to the, what is third season? No, second season. Which season is that?
Okay, what we're doing now is because we have 2 solid seasons sort of under our belt.
So that would be okay. So that was a little bit of plus, right? So
yeah.
The season extension
party plus.
Okay, Biotensegrity Party plus. Well, so then since it's a good sunny day seemingly everywhere, right? So even in the places which are usually gloomy, right? So and we see Doug is projecting the sun all the way from Boston, right? And then Graham has all sorts of sun in UK, and I have all sorts of sun here. Well, I'm in Helsinki, so let's kind of make it into the sun shining over the Biotensegrity parties, and welcome you to this season plus.
Cheers.
Okay.
All right. Yes. So now we're gonna thank you. We're gonna ask everybody to turn off their cameras. I'm going to spotlight Leonid, and he's going to give us this amazing presentation.
Well, thank you for kind of your kind words about my amazing presentation. Well, look, this title, it's been a product of some kind of collective intelligence. We had different conversations what it should be, right? And I think that the one that came up now is relatively poetic. So how deep is skin deep? And you know, the thing about the origami. So look, what I'm going to do is that I'm mostly going to use the actual like footage of their bodies, and well, I'm trying to cut the faces there, so you see that you can see the way how the real, you know, movements and displacements are being done. And basically we are moving to a very simple question: what is the movement? You know, it sounds very, very obvious, like what is the movement? You know, I'm bending my arm, what's happening? Like what kind of model do we need to bring to interpret something as simple as that? So that's really a first question that we have to bring. And the thing that I'm trying to do is just to bring some more of this kind of naivety, and kind of what you see is what you get, or like immediate instant interpretation perspective, so that we suddenly would get some questions, right? But you know, the line that I always start with is actually very simple. You know, in the current model of biomechanics, it's all based on bones, right? So the bones are the ones that move first, and then things are being kind of added there, the muscles, the ligaments, and so on and so forth. And then somehow, somewhere, you know, over there, the skin is being added. And when anatomy dissections are being done, the skin is the one that is being removed first. So whatever kind of movement or measurements or studies or even interpretations are done during the dissections, they're done, you know, by removing the skin, like just outright. So that's where what I want to put here into simple perspectives. I'm not very fanciful in the dimension of the presentations, and let's just start with those simple words. Slideshow from the beginning. So the keyword, how deep is skin deep? Origami, skin folding, and inner body movements. So the key question that we are going to ask ourselves when looking at the animal movement, which is effectively the one presented by the angular displacement, what is it? Is it pivoting or wedging? You know, we are at the Biotensegrity party, right? And here we are pointing out at the uniformity, at the distribution, at the superstability, and all these properties that everything happens at once and so on, which is very exciting idea, right? But this idea is actually mathematically complex. So the interpretation of biotensegrity as well, tensegrity as the framework of superstability, you know, the one which is able to handle the first order flex. I mean, it's not an easy thing to interpret unless you're really mathematically bound. And what I try to talk about is that, you know, before we get ourselves really ready to think, feel, and actually interpret then and get the practical applications of the biotensegrity, we have to try as much as possible to upgrade and diversify our understanding of the most obvious things. So hence the usage of the words pivoting versus wedging. I'll try to explain what I mean, right? And the thing is that when we talk about wedging, this is where we are looking at this well-known principle, what you see is what you get. Or when we talk about pivoting, what you see is what is easy to calculate. That's really the first point to understand. And this is straight from the biomechanics textbooks, right? And this is a standard interpretation. What is happening? This is the view, right? I mean, I just pulled it out half an hour ago from the search on the angular movement at an elbow. And this is the thing from the research gate. This is a setup. The person actually takes the real kind of real life photo, the researcher, right? So he takes the real life photo, asks this gentleman to bend his arm, and then what does he do? He immediately proceeds to assigning the pivot there. And that's what you see in every single type of the biomechanics textbook. So this one is a version which studies the forces and then, you know, also assigns the numbers to them and so on. This is the one that shows you the idea of the pivoting and labels it as flexion and extension. But my first point is there to be the child, right? So it's there to be, I know, the Martian, whoever. So just ask the question, why for this guy we moved from his live image of the hand and this live bending, why did we move to this representation? Like, what grounds do we have on this? Do we have good enough grounds to justify this kind of intellectual leap, this jump? Because obviously this live guy, he is not skinless. He has the skin. Even on this picture that you see here, the contours of the body are being drawn. But if you look at it, as if for this person who has bent his arm, as if nothing has happened at his elbow. nothing has happened as the difference, as the deformation of his skin at the point of the concentration of forces, and nothing has happened at the opposite part where you experience the greatest angular acceleration, right? So you see, that's the one that actually requires the most of the divergence control. So this is a converging thing, and this is a diverging thing. So centripetal and centrifugal. Well, what experiences the centrifugal displacement there? The skin. So, I mean, here I'm not doing any particular science or anything. I'm just asking the most naive and even dumb question. But this dumb question actually has to have a good answer. And this is really, you know, like a very simple opening. If we move here, you see, then the whole thing becomes more complex, right? So you see, that was kind of the entry level of the interpretation. And then you see these guys are moving in, and that's another, extract from the ResearchGate papers. So they're trying to accommodate the irregularity of the shape, their, kind of the inclinations of the surfaces of contact. And, like you can see here, the precise measurements and the inclinations of the angles and so on, but they all converge to the same idea, that the pivot internally exists, and that's this pivot which actually defines the true control of the movement, the true control of the angular displacement, because everything that we interpret as the movement is the one which has synovial joints and the angular displacement. And you see, these are more fanciful drawings here, but which are assigning the muscles and the way how they stabilize things and blah, blah, blah. But we always come down to this first point. Why we have made this first intellectual jump and took this guy, took the person at his native form, alive, and then interpreted him through the pivoting of the joint. Like it's the question which is a kindergarten level question. Like it's doesn't take any intelligence to ask this question. This is just being as naive, doesn't take any education, doesn't take anything. Like, oh, I'm bending my arm, what's happening there? Wow, the skin is folding. How is it folding? What is the connection that it has with the behavior, mechanical behavior of what's happening further in? What are we supposed to interpret first? Why? Right? Okay, there is a logic there which would, invite us to say, hey, you know what? This is a frictionless joint. So this frictionless joint is the one that has to move first. Say, wait a second. That's calculation, right? In real life, it doesn't work like that. So you see, in real life, what we have is that it's that kind of micro deformation of the skin that happens first. And it's also, there could be also pretty solid mechanics for this, because if you look at the inner surface, what's going to happen? Where are you going to have the maximum concentration of forces if you are putting two things together? So that would be near the point of the wedge, right? So you see, that's where compression forces, they would be concentrating over there. And where you would get the greatest tendency for the angular, so for the tangential, right? So you see, like normal velocity, right? So you see, for the maximum velocity, for the maximum instability, well, it's going to be here if you measure it in respect to the folding wedge. So, it doesn't take a genius. You take a paper, say, oh, where does it experience the greatest wedging? Here inside, right? what is the thing which has the greatest, troubles or the greatest challenges to holding the tension. That would be the outside. That's a very simple thing. So that's really as much as I wanted to say, and that's why I'm just saying, hey guys, let's look at these people. I didn't even remove those things, right? So it's a deposit photos, generic individuals happily smiling. Well, what happens? We are looking in and saying, aha, this lady indeed has the wedging. That wedging, where the skin folds are taking place from the most superficial layer, right? Because it's the most superficial layer, that superficial layer that experiences the compression first. Very simple. And then as we start looking further, say, okay, look at this, what happens with aging? With aging, you experience some troubles with joints, right? You experience the dehydration, you experience the arthrosis, you experience the loss of the range of motion, all this kind of typical descriptions. But what else is coming there, right? Is the change of the skin properties. Well, maybe that's the factor that is connected, right? So the deterioration and the loss of the complex folding properties of the skin is the one that translates into the challenges, which then have to be resolved within the joint. So the joint becomes a hostage to these troubles. So, that's a very simple point. The wedging, right? So you see maximum centrifugal, and then maximum centripetal, centrifugal. And then there's a big question mark. What moves and how? All right, because in fact, we're talking about the real life. And in real life, you're supposed to, there is no such thing as pure pivoting. There's frictionless joints. We are bound by the constraints, by our reaction times. Because if we don't have reaction times, well, what happens? Well, you're basically paralyzed, right? If it's a paraplegic person who doesn't have reaction times. Even the spastic person has reaction times, they're delayed, whatever, but that's the case. So we are alive. That's the key point. So that's why when you have to study it, you have to study it from the perspective of the mechanics of being alive, not from the mechanics of being dead. But again, we have to put this into very clear and tangible perspective. And see here, I'm pointing at the kids with disabilities. These are two kind of milder forms, right? So it's a walking sort of kind of chair. And, well, I mean, there are two different cases. And what you're seeing there, I'm taking the example here of the foot. So everybody is busy with studying, what the Achilles is doing. Let's look at what kind of the joint surfaces and how the angles are distributing and so on. The reality is very powerful and very simple. First thing, what happens with this wedge? If the skin is competent, then you have the control of the wedge, and that competence passes on through the whole thing. And then, before you pass on to the level of the heel, you have to go through all the usual links which you would see on anatomical drawings, right? You're going to see, all these lines, right? So you see all these connections that go towards the so-called toes extensors and so on. but they are the ones which would be tensionally dealing with those wedges. So the wedging effect. So that's the point. We should forget about the joint surfaces as the primary thing, because it was really frictionless displacement at the joint. Like we would never have an opportunity to get any control of the movement, because basically the reaction times that you need to handle the frictionless joints is beyond what we have, right? So you see, our muscles are dramatically slow. The fastest muscles that we have are the muscles of the eyes, and that's 1/20th of a second. Regular muscles that we have, like the muscle of the foot and so on, it takes them quarter of a second to react. How could you possibly control a frictionless joint with the muscle which takes quarter of a second to react? You have to put two and two together. Like you have to put, there has to be some reality there, right? If you have this gaping hole of quarter of a second for every single change, every slightest change, micro change of the angular seconds and minutes, where are you going? Like you're going to be destroyed. You're never going to get to move. Everything is going to be destroyed. So who are the children with the greatest disabilities? The ones who have the frictionless joints, but who cannot control them. But the first place, what happens to them? Their skin is not competent. So that is really a very simple point. And what I want to show through this is kind of just, take this simple pictures, right? And say, okay, you know what? When you are moving, right? When you're moving, that's an angular displacement. Imagine that was the elbow. So what would happen? These two parts coming together, right? So if these are the two parts coming together, then if one was the shoulder, the other one was the wrist. Well, what happens? You got all sorts of the concentrations which would come at the inner facet of the elbow, because what happens? Then it's their, crack principle, right? So you see the principle, how do you crack the walnuts? You take the two handles, put the walnut inside, right? So you see, put it closest to the pivot, to the center, and small effort allows you to develop a huge amplification. So we know the living legend of Steve Levin, that he used to be, for many years, he was capable of cracking walnuts for wedging them into his biceps fold, right? So that would be very much the non-biotensegral behavior. But the fact here, that's what it is. The greatest concentrations of the compression emerge over here. But then the thing which you also have to look at is that if you were to look at the other side, right? So you see, if you were to draw those lines further, well, let me do it in a nice way. See, then you have to draw those lines further and say, oh, if we were drawing the extension of those lines, because those are the lines of movement, then what would happen? This is where you are going to have the greatest acceleration. See, here you would have the greatest angular acceleration. So what would that be? That would be the representation of the outer side of the elbow, right? So here on the inner side of the elbow, you've got the wedging, cracking, maximum compression. On the outer side, you've got the maximum tension, where all of your tensional structures have to be competent enough to handle that displacement. But now, in this conversation, we are more focused on what happens how do you handle such extreme compressions? And I always invite everybody to reread Graham's book. I don't remember it. I think it's chapter 9 or chapter 7, where he talks about this. He frequently comes back to the point about what is the main question that we always come back to, speaking of the dissatisfaction with the standard model. How do you handle the extreme local concentration of forces? There are no good answers. So that's where we are, right? And then what is the model that we are going to discuss here? That's going to be the model which points out the origami folding. And this is very interesting, right? So you see, there's a whole mathematical conceptual framework, which is called the linkage folding algorithms, which discusses how the shapes could be transformed. So you see, it's the same number of nodes, but what looks like a regular circle, right? So you see, if you start looking at the origamization of this regular circle, right? So you see, kind of give it this roughness, then it is able to experience the fold. And let me throw some of the ideas at you so that you can visualize how these folds could be working, right? So you see, that's the formation of those teeth. And you see there are different algorithms there of how these teeth and which sequence they could be done. Let me throw some ideas at you. So let me throw some pictures at you so that you would understand how it all looks like in real life. So first, I will get this thing. So I was using that image. Yes. See, I was using that image in the Tensegrity Assisted Therapy course. So where I was talking about the understanding of how we have to start thinking about the active role of the torso. Because, we don't have, in standard biomechanics, we don't have any even remotely reasonable explanations for how does the torso work. Like, think about it. You've got chest cavity, no less, abdominal cavity, huge gaping holes, which are barely covered by that thin muscles, which are completely incapable of handling the wedging that goes across them. Why don't we collapse? It's a very simple question. If you look at if you were trying to emulate that form in any engineering format, that would be just buckling of the thin cylinder, like a tin can, the beer can, the Coca-Cola can. Press, boom, collapse. But we don't. So, and that's, once again, I'm using those mechanical examples here to highlight that what we have is the presence and the combination of the complex mechanical behaviors that work as the gear wheels, that present the mechanical behavior of the gear wheels, but without being structurally the gear wheels, right? So that's the key message there. We, in biotensegrity, we study the mechanical behaviors. And we point out that biotensegrity, or we'll start the biotensegrity as the application of tensegrity to biology, right? So biotensegrity gives us this idea that we have the framework one framework which absorbs all sorts of mechanical behaviors without the need to be structurally like this, right? So you see, that's a central question. Is your abdomen being made of gear wheels? No, it's not, right? Is it being made of gear wheels of this three kind, and then, you know, the external ring and so on? No, it's not. But is it capable of behaving like this? The answer is yes. And more, right? So that's really the central point that we want to get, that there is such a variety of the responses that could be assigned to their so-called cavities, right? And then this, you know, that then tensegrities as such, they're capable of dealing with otherwise the systems that would otherwise buckle. So that's really a very simple idea, to understand that you cannot handle the buckling by muscular layers. You have to have a model which would inevitably include the skin, because the skin is the one that responds first. Simply, it's the one which is the closest to the surface. Nothing is more superficial than the skin, but because it's the most superficial, it also means, paradoxically, that this is the most deep. The most superficial, the greatest superficiality of the skin means that on the milliscale, right, the scale of the millimeters, and the micro scale, the scale of the micrometers, it's the one that experiences the greatest local stresses and deformations, which it has to be capable of handling. That's, again, a very simple idea. And of course, I have the luxury of seeing the individuals who are in a kind of transition. So look at this, like this, right? You see what's happening? This is the abdominal part. See, with this kid, I'm able to put my hand all the way into his abdomen. Like, my hand is big. And what happens? Nothing. That's kind of the new development that we see there as we started to approach the thing from the skin activation perspective. Because before, the skin was collapsing in the usual way. See, we look at this, I'm able to get inside, just dive in. This is another kid. See, look at that. The same fold as we have seen on Jesus Christ there. So this fold being a critical element for improving the quality of the stability. And here is a milder child, and you see here what's happening. As she developed those folds, what's happening? Now, from this child who had troubles in sitting, now I'm pressing from the top with my entire weight, and what happens? She doesn't collapse. So this is the illustration of the behaviors which are giving a very simple reasoning, that the skin is capable of those origami-like wedgings. So that when you apply the loads, the critical point is how that convergence from what looks as the surface goes inside. Because by right, if you look at the abdominal cavity shall buckle. Everything which has this emptiness under the loads buckles, especially if the loads are diverse, material is soft, and the loads could come at most unexpected directions, amplitudes, forces, and so on. But we don't buckle. We don't buckle so much that we take it for granted. And that prevents us from asking the good questions. So, as I said, it's very simple. Cavities buckle. For this thing, my thermos not to buckle, it has a very, very thick Indian steel. Then it holds. But if I take the cola can, the empty one, it would collapse. The moment I change the angle slightly, because there would be local concentrations and then there would be cracks. And that moves us into the idea. When there are local concentrations, that means cracks would appear. And today there is a whole new science, which is called the science of the peridynamics. That's the science which studies the cracks. And this is really what I also want to bring as this idea. The research center dedicated to the science of cracks. So if we were to look at the cracks from the engineering perspective, cracks are the enemy to anything man-made, because cracks make the material brittle. And of course, all the funding and all these things which are coming into peridynamics, it's about how the man-made materials, how they crack and how they get destroyed. So what to do to handle the situation. But if you think about it, you realize that actually, life, humans, as the pinnacle there, right, or like all forms of life there, have solved. First, it had to solve the problem of cracks. It had to make the cracks, instead of the enemy, to domesticate cracks. And that's what origami does. Origami is a technical, tangible domestication of cracks. And let me show you some examples. See, look at that. See, as I'm looking at this child, what's happening? It's the skin which is responding first. He is bending at the skin level. Now, you see, look, for example, when we come to the scoliosis, you'll have all sorts of explanations which are going to lead you into this line of reasoning, okay, which pivot, which angle, how it has to be, and so on. But the main point is here. It's that fold, the fold within the skin. It's missing competence within the skin that causes then the entire thing to collapse. That's the maximum concentration of wedging. If the skin is not capable, if it's not able to get the fold and it goes into the cusp, if it collapses, buckles, then you are doomed. And if you look at this kid, right, so you see, that's what you can see. See, for him, that's the part where he falls, right? But again, the thing is, as his skin competence has been developing, his previously buckled abdominal space and so on has changed. He's been struggling with reflux and all these things which are kind of obvious there, right? But skin properties, not yet the change of the alignments or whatever. Same alignments, different skin, different light. And as we go further, see, that's the way you can see the spontaneous emergence of the folds. And you see, if you look at it closer, you're going to find this, right? You see, look at that. So those wrinkles micro wrinkles. They are critically important. They are the ones which take the thousands of cracks through the skin and neutralize. And what we have, whether it's the abdominal cavities, whether it's the frictionless joints and so on, these are luxuries which are enabled, empowered by these origami properties of the skin. See? And then I'm going to show you the other side, right? Those elbows, right? So you see those things that you see on the knuckles and so on, this kind of skin folds and so on, they matter. They are the ones which are controlling the other side. So the skin folds, they're not only able to control the origami of conversion of the compression, but they're also able to convert the origami of tension. So that's why you see for this kid, his elbow is so spectacularly folded, right? It's like you can see the elbow skin is so dramatically different, or the knee skin is now so dramatically different from the rest of his body. And now I'm going to show you this. So this is the girl where you can really see the primary lines of the movement very, very clearly. So for her, the gradual emergence of the buttocks, right? So you see this presence of the separation between the one buttock, another buttock, and the actual triangulation in between, and then the transition to that famous thoracolumbar fascia and so on. But it all starts with this. It starts with this capacity of the skin to go into the origami state. And you see here, it's incredible. So you see, once you study this, you can see this formation of those folds is so critical. It's really amazing. And that's really bears a number of questions, right? How do we interpret it, right? So you see, where do we move, and where do we kind of get the next level of thinking of how we, get to see the so-called movement, which is actually the angular displacement. And my message there is actually really, really simple. So if we really start looking at the map of the skin, well, we see all this tiling. But if we look deeper and kind of get it stained, we can see that how this thing distributes. Also, that links it to the famous videos of Jean-Claude Gumberto, right? So you see all of his models with the things that are happening internally and how he has been drawing them with all these irregular folds and so on. So being part of this format and the transition of what would be the mechanics capable of that skin folding integration. And again, I always bring this very simple message. Muscle is a wild, uncontrollable beast. Muscle is so difficult to control. It has elastin in it. It has, it actually responds to electrical stimulus which can emerge out of nowhere. So how can you possibly rely on the muscle to control the frictionless joints, whilst the muscle can pick up the electric signal out of nowhere? It doesn't make any sense at all. the stabilization of joint or frictionless joints by the muscle, like it's just one of the most ludicrous ideas that can possibly come. You know, it doesn't hold any water. I mean, like, it's okay for 17th century, right? But the moment you start looking at, you know, like, what would be the worst possible thing that you can design for the stability of the frictionless joints that converge to the pivot? You know, that would be the muscle. So, but then on the other hand, you see all that. You see the skin. The skin is great. The skin has these properties of the leather: pure collagen, limit of tension, limit of compression. It clearly presents the constraint that we need. And then, like the, you know, Gulliver and the Lilliputians, thousands of microfolds, which are then containing, and then the same thing going from the bottom, right? So we see, like, whatever from, let's say, the periosteum, the deep fascia, and so on. But you see that mesh, the mesh that spreads, that converges, right? And again, that makes this conversation about the multi-scale transition from meters to centimeters to millimeters to micrometers to nanometers, makes it tangible. You see, those things we experience every day, this conversion to nanometers, without us paying attention to those miracles of those folds which we have. And this is really the conversation that I, in this short presentation, just wanted to bring, right? So I wanted to kind of to open. And then one more thing that I wanted to say is that, you see, this conversation also opens the thing how many different images we have in anatomy. You see, this is pulled up from the internet. So this one kind of takes the real snapshot of anatomy and converts it into this lousy picture. If you look at this picture, say, you know, what kind of freaking origami he's talking about? Like, you know. But then, if you look at this, you say, wow. You know, you look at this, here you've got your teeth, right? This image clearly highlights for you that those teeth, even at the structural, you know, like most primitive structural representation, could exist. Of course, if you start converting it to mechanical behaviors, it would be even more complex, and you can get more and more and more and more of those. But this is a very simple line, right? So you see, like, if you take this drawing, you say, hey, this is obvious, you know, the top part, you know, Velcro-like sits on the bottom one. The bottom one sits, you know, has the active insertion into the one. So if you look at this, the image of the gear wheels would be like, hey, we can have hundreds, thousands of the gear wheel models and gear ratios in terms of the mechanical behavior just based on the skin alone. So that's the message out of their current representations, and this transition from the, you know, pictures, snapshots of reality, to the interpretation, which is kind of this one you see in between, and this one is really, really, really. But then you see sometimes you find this type of pictures, like blah, blur, epidermis, dermis, subcutaneous tissue, muscle. You know, you look at this, that's your image, you're never going to get anything understood. But of course, it all starts with this idea that somehow we have this unspoken permission, right, to remove the skin. Somehow we have those images of zombies being able to move whilst the skin just kind of peels off them. Somehow we have the images of moving skeletons and so on. So these are all this incredible depth of the pollution and contamination that we have intellectually. And that prevents us from being able to look at the things in a naive way on the one hand, but on the other hand, of course, it takes a more complex science, like in that instance, the peridynamics, the science of cracks, that we can start making sense out of it, right? And if I kind of zoom in here, just before I finish, I will give some words here. Peridynamics enables the prediction of the crack path, right? Complex. And without resorting to special treatment of mathematical singularities, as in the case of the continuum mechanics. So that's the standard things, that is the standard equations that everybody is using in biomechanics. So the peridynamics equation of motions is valid everywhere, even in the presence of cracks. But that's the engineer speaking. But if we flip life and say life is something completely anti-engineered, something which is the complete opposite, what would that mean in the tangible way? In a tangible way, that would mean life domesticates the cracks, takes the cracks, converts them, and makes them our friends. And that's what we see through the images of the origami, right? And how most simple shapes can converge, fold, and do this thing. So that was my best attempt to being compact. And I guess we can open the discussion. Marie, don't hear?
We're coming, we're coming.
Ah,
Susan?
okay.
Yes, we're coming, we're coming, we're coming, we're here. Life domesticates the cracks. That's amazing.
Susan, can you change your view, please?
Yeah, I'm going to put gallery view. So if you want to be on camera, you can turn it on now. We're going to jump into the discussion. And my two amazing quotes are life domesticates the cracks and muscle is a wild, uncontrollable beast.
I mean, it is. Just
So that's pretty wild. Lydia is here and had a question. Lydia, did you want to put yourself on camera, unmute and ask, or did you want someone to ask for you?
Okay, thank you.
I don't quite hear you. That's better.
Oh, okay. It's a bit of a complex system. It was a beautiful presentation. And I wonder if Leonid could go the next step and take the pictures of actual people in the skin folds and talk about what in the human being, what structures he sees when he looks at those skin folds. That's it.
well, but you see, look, truth to be told, I have been surprised with that, for the last, at least 20 minutes. Let's say the first time I really started paying attention to the skin was about 97, 98, I think. But really, I had no way to give it the mathematical interpretation. It's just kind of this idea, okay, the skin just happens to change, right? So you see, as the child changes, the skin happens to change, and then also you have those children who come with most weirdest skins, right? Either they're too thin, or they're too glued, or they're too sensitive, or whatever, right? And you sort of just first collect the observations, and then you kind of also evolve to this thing. It's like, oh, okay, yeah. Why do we actually discount it? Like, Because you see, that's a basic idea. If you talk about the mathematical representation of the complex system, right? You say, okay, we take the naive view, we take the full set, right? The full distribution. And then we say, okay, you know what? We believe that the factors, this and this and this and this, we can safely remove them for the sake of simplicity. And whatever we're going to get as a end result is going to be a reasonably okay model, which sort of allows us to catch the idea, right? But the point is that you have to prove it. See, that's a very tricky point. It's a very important point. Like what I was using there as that guy in the presentation, nobody thinks about it. Let me find him. I'm gonna make him, I'm gonna make him bigger and put the new slide and make him bigger. And remove it. Okay, share the screen and look at this guy. You see, this guy randomly popped up out of the internet. Some biomechanics research. Nobody asked this question, like, why on earth you have made this leap of faith and you have converged, let's say you have converted this guy into a pivot. Why? Have you made all the preliminary qualifications and proven that all the other factors which are obviously being involved, that they actually do not matter? See, that's the thing. When we engage and when we move to the point of saying, hey, this is the reality. People have skin. So if you, Mr. Biomechanist, want to come up with the model of pivoting, and you remove the skin and discard it and say, well, it's actually not critical for my model, well, the proof is on you. You take the reality, you say, well, the reality is so simple, we can remove these parts. So, but the thing is, once we see the reality, then things are different. And again, of course, I am in a privileged position that I observe the life and the transformation of those 0.5 of the human population, which represents the 99% of our morphological variations. So you see, the thing is that we are too good, we don't realize how good are average humans, that we are not just that we are superhumans, right? So you see that because the gap between what should have happened if we were engineered structures and how we are, is so huge.
We don't know how lucky we are.
We don't know how lucky we are. We don't appreciate it by a mile how huge we are and how many,
and
components.
The skin was never separate from the rest of us, right? At no point in our development, embryologically, was the skin a separate thing that got imported in from another country and then tacked on at the end.
If anything, it's the other way around, right? So you see, you've grown into your skin envelope, right? So you see, your ectoderm has been there right from the start, right? So you see, connected to your endo and mesoderms, right? So that's a very simple point.
It's wonderful. I've been rolling all of this around since you brought it up in the tensegrity assisted therapy class, and which I'm taking not because I'm a therapist, because I'm not, but I'm taking it so that I can understand how you see the science behind what you're doing from the perspective of understanding biotensegrity. It's been amazing. So then we had this paper that I sent around. We sent around with the newsletter on the origami and the tissues and how origami's related to tensegrity, and we're finding more on that. Chris, unfortunately, Chris got booted and hasn't been able to get back in. We've been having technical issues there, but she found another amazing paper just going into origami and talking about its relationship to tensegrity, as opposed to biotensegrity, but just structurally. And so a lot of engineering people, mathematicians have been looking at these connections. And so, of course, we have to be open to this in terms of the biotensegrity. I don't see anybody's hand up, and there are not too many of us here. If you want to jump in with a comment or question, Mike, please jump in.
Hello, hi. I was curious to know, so I think I understand sort of like the overall premise, and I'm wondering in terms of in your treatment and your therapy, how does this different awareness of the model like practically affect the way that you work? And what do you think are some of the implications of possible of basing so much treatment and systems on an inaccurate model as that sort of like fulcrum bone scenario? It's sort of like what are the impacts of having an incorrect model, and how does a more accurate model, how has that affected your work personally?
Ooh, wow, let's put it like this, right? So the incorrect model to begin with, right? So you see, I believe that when it comes to regular people, and the body work, or the presence of the body workers, the disastrous state of their conceptual model is compensated by their just kind of kinesthetic feel and going more by feel rather than by mind, right? So that's one thing. Now, of course, where this disaster is the most obvious is when we deal with the rehabilitation and people who have especially experienced anything which is labeled as neurological, right? But I guess to go into the details of how it affects my work, right? So you see, we have started this tensegrity assisted therapy course with Mariana, right? Which was, first supposed to be, 5 hours, 7 hours, but it kind of grown to 30 hours. And, of going through the larger field of implications. And it just been this way that like most of the people, they have been rewatching the introductory sessions over and over, right? Because it basically connects and so on. And like Susan said, the important thing to look at it is that what is a therapy? The therapy is an applied science, right? So you see, that's why in effect you are looking at the way how you need to move from theory to the application to give the true justance and the true test of theory. So that would be the thing. But on the other hand, the softer, much milder version of my perspective would be, guys, look, this opens, first of all, the idea of observations, like start looking at what happens to people, right? Like when you face troubles, when you face challenges in when people present some functional or pain related issues, start opening your eyes first to the skin and its behavior, but even more importantly, start opening your hand perception and start looking at all of those displacements, formations of those folds, just start collecting the data so that you get to familiarize yourself, or because all your life you've been measuring, you've been either looking at how people do the integrated things or trying to move the limbs or the torso, like watching the movements, but we have all been trained and conditioned to try to see the inner pivot, the inner pivots, the inner glidings, the inner sort of joint surfaces or ligaments or whatever when we look at the real life person. So that means that to expand your perception would be the first thing. And the second thing is, look, there are so many easy ways to just get some skin activation, right? From just superficial massages to the acupressure mats to using some sort of whatever, contrast showers, whatever, right? Just take it as a basic idea that livening up the skin can give you a lot of positive surprises with the clients that you don't even expect. So
Also, I think also what you're talking about is to re-examine your assumptions, but you can't do that unless you can identify your assumptions.
That's a good
unless
point.
you can identify the framework that's been kind of imbued through your education, through our culture, whatever it is. You didn't even know you had that framework, right? And I when I was listening to this with our new influencer Mike here, I was thinking, wow, I wonder if somebody will go into making puppets that use the skin structurally, or maybe they already have, in terms of making models, puppets, deployables for outer space. The other thing, Leonid, is Mariana wanted you to talk about the work out versus work in concept that you guys have been conveying to us in the class.
Well, but Steve has the raised hand there for quite a while.
I know, but finish this thought and then we go to Steve next.
Okay, Casey. But well, you see, the point there, right, is that once we start looking at this perspective, right? So you see the perspective that things happen at you, right? So you see, meaning that when you are experiencing any change of position, what happens at the same time, there is the external convergence, right? So you see your own whatever bending of the hand converts into the being the external force over your skin. So this kind of convolution, right? So you see internal, external, whatever you do internally, you are experiencing the external loads, right? So when you're trying to do something functionally outwardly oriented, like scratch my nose, right? So in that respect, when I do any kind of workout, I inevitably, once we get the skin in, I inevitably get the work in. So what we are talking about, right, is that since the work in is always connected to the workout, they are in that sense two sides of the same coin. So basically, if we look at today's structure or today's framework of any kind of fitness training or whatever, even the traditional sort of systems, whether it's Tai Chi or yoga or whatever, right? They're all in their not in their original poetic expressions, right, but in the modernized kind of versions, they're all being reduced to the workouts. And the question in, okay, so the same way as you facilitate your workouts with all sorts of tools, starting from the dumbbells and the rubber belts and whatever else, well, makes sense to start facilitating your work-ins. Do them systematically, right? So you see, because the beauty of it is that it's the other person who can work at you. So that would be a work in, right? And the work in would be a more general interpretation of the idea of the body work. And of course, you can utilize the reaction forces and the additional tools to do the self work-ins of different kinds. And that's why, and for that, we should be very grateful to the modern day chemical industry. So for producing all sorts of the, viscoelastic magical balls and foams and so on, which really allow us to play with the different, types of the false responses and so on. So, and, that's really a very simple idea that
Yep.
we have a huge workout industry, but we have, in fact, no work-ins.
And I can highly recommend Sean Beakey's YouTube channel. He's doing some brilliant, brilliant things that to me are exactly that kind of philosophy. But Steve's had his hand up. Steve, this reminds me of the discussion we had years and years ago when we were first talking about the kinesio tape and how it was functioning mechanically in the system to provide additional compression against which tension could manifest. Go ahead, Steve.
All right. Well, what I wanted to do is do a three-dimensional folding model. I don't know how well you can see this because of the crazy things that happen with it.
Susan, can you pin him so we can?
Yeah, let me pin you. And then Steve, the other thing is,
The background.
let's see, spotlight. I'm going to spotlight you for everybody.
Okay,
Actually,
well,
Yeah, and we need to take out the virtual background because the figure is disappearing.
all right, let me see.
Yeah,
what I can do. Let me get rid of.
And now he's muted.
He was doing a green screen there.
Yeah, that's why it's.
Yeah, I'll do a green screen.
Well, you came
on the
prepared.
background. Here we go.
okay, pull it closer to you. There we go. There we go.
All right. Well, here's a model of all that folding and expanding in an icosahedron, which gets back to the basic model that I've been working with all along. Here's actually a little smaller model that may be easier to see.
Yeah, hold it closer to you, Steve. If it's too close to the camera, what happens is
No, Susan, what we have to what we have to do is remove the blur background.
Well, you can see it now because you can see.
yeah, I can
Yeah.
see it. Hold it up a little higher. That's good. Joe Clinton made this for you?
Yes, this is Joe Clinton. He made this. It oscillates between a tetrahedron and an expanded octahedron, but it all comes to what I start out with, the icosahedron. So it's a three-dimensional folding model showing that you can expand and contract it. And you have to imagine that in these spaces, the same thing is happening at a different scale level. So it's an infinite model of the same thing happening in 3 dimensions.
So will
When
you
you-
hold it up again and show all 3 points? So if you close it, it's a tetrahedron.
All right, here's,
Turn it a little so everybody can see that it's a tetrahedron. And then thank you. And then open it a little bit and it becomes the icosahedron about there. Okay.
all right.
And then keep opening it and it opens to the octahedron. There it is. Nice. Thank you.
All right, now you got it. The other thing is that if you are doing any external movement, the only way you can do an external movement of anything is by taking an external force. That means you have to get an external force into your body. And the only way it can get in is through the skin, because that's your only interface with the external part. So that every force that you give in any movement has to come through your skin first.
Right. Gravity, ground reaction force,
All
Yeah.
right, all your
A push,
gravity
a shove.
has to come through your skin first. So the skin is a vital part of it. And what you do is that skin, that force that hits the skin is a compression force that hits a tension thing, is so it tightens up the rope. And the mechanism is that the body is a continuous tension system. So it's like pulling on a rope. You can, pulling on any point in a rope makes the whole rope equally tensioned. So as soon as you tension that skin in any way, you've tensioned everything in the body. So, and then it leads into compression. Tension begets the compression. So it's always, everything you do has to come through that skin. You can't do anything without it.
It's great. Now, theoretically, we stop in about 5 minutes. Leonid, I know you've got to travel tomorrow too. We've got a question from Barbara about what are good examples of work-ins?
Well, okay, so to a certain extent, do you want to pin me, or how do we do it, or we get back to
Are you
gallery view?
showing us? Or are
Okay.
you
No,
talking?
no, that's it. Oh, it's a gallery view. Okay, because Steve was there. No, I mean, look, guys, the thing is that it's actually the work in is in the eye of the beholder, right? So it's like first point is that every time you put your hands on somebody, you are already committing to a work in. Like whether you think about it or not, doesn't matter. Any body work therapy is a work in. And my message has always been very simple, is that, well, you can look at this as, okay, I am doing a massage and I'm happy enough with this type of their famous triad of I'm trying to relax, release, and improve the circulation, kind of being as general and as non-specific as you can possibly be. Or you can be very specific and say, oh, I'm trying to release, or I'm trying to improve the alignment or whatever. But those would be, again, the types of thinking which skip and fast forward the phases of interaction. And in that sense, the idea is simple. The moment you come in contact with another person and you produce anything like intentional, you're already doing a work-in. So my point is very simple. It's better to expand your horizons and kind of accept that yes, that's a work-in, and let's try to kind of get the awareness of those kind of transition phases, right? So the transformations which are happening along the way, because once you start being aware of them, suddenly you will start collecting the data, you will start interpreting the data, you will get out of this kind of previously tunneled vision, right? And then you might as well discover a lot of other things just in your own existent activity. So that's really the first message. It's before going, oh, these are the new specific formats of the work-ins. Well, every one of us in the work-in department, the moment I put my butt on the chair, I'm doing a work-in.
And so, yeah, you're making me think of so many things. So, like in push hands, in Tai Chi Chuan, there's an importance of having that connection be that light touch. So to borrow a phrase from Leonid and Mariana, so that you are very dynamically indistinguishable, one person from the other, which is something that you want, right? In order to make that system work. But then you've got me thinking of like American football, the shoulder pads and that sort of thing. The person puts on an interface in their uniform so that when they're hit, because that goal would be to tackle the other person, right? The work in is, I want to knock you over, but they've got this interface that will shield, that will distribute the force so that they're less likely to be perturbed to the extent of being tackled. So I just think this reframes so many things for us.
Yeah, and look, in that sense, if you get even back to the American football thing, right, is that the fact is that it's at the end of the day, it's how well you convert, right? So even if the other party, why some people, whatever, take hockey or whatever, right? So some people, by being hit or whatever, they get stronger. The others one, they get weaker, right? So you see, that's the point of the distribution and the point of the absorption. So even the negative intent can have the positive effects if it's distributed well enough. On the other hand, even the positive effect can have negative after effects if it's not distributed well enough. So that would be a really simple idea. So it's all about the conversion at the interface. Yes.
And then for Doug or anybody else here who's a pianist, maybe Doug's still on his interface of the bicycle, but the interface of the piano and the keys and the bench and the pedals, these are the interfaces that the professional pianist, that any pianist would need to be working with. Yeah. And how does that change things? And then they work accordingly.
Yeah, of course. You work at the piano, or you work out at the piano works in at you.
Doug, did you want to say something?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, there can be such a tendency to stiffen near that interface. The tightening the ankle and the foot on the floor, and tightening the hip joints and the pelvis to try to create stability. That's usually the conscious or unconscious intention. But when there's that supple quality all the way to the contacts, then you have ultimate support and power potentially as well. So yes, simply put, agreed.
Yeah. And then Mike with the puppets, I would think, right? I'm thinking now of the old-fashioned string puppets from the stick, right? I'm manipulating things at the stick and string level to get the puppet to move, but then whatever is happening with the puppet, if it bangs into the wall, another puppet, that's feedback up through that system into me. Mike, would you agree?
Yeah, I absolutely would. And actually, so there are two kinds of competing, I mean, I shouldn't say competing styles of puppetry, but there are direct connection styles of puppetry, and then there's more I don't know what the term would be, but where you're more sort of divorced from the object. So Japanese bunraku, or tabletop puppetry, which is essentially people who are you are holding on to the puppet as you're moving it. It's a totally different style of interface that happens. And one of my sort of biggest pet peeves with marionettes, don't tell any marionettists, but that because you have that giant distance between you and the object, and so much gets lost, the marionette's relationship is entirely relative to gravity. That's why it always appears dead unless you're animating it. Whereas the interface is sort of everything. What I think is so neat about tensegrities being able to connect with tensegrities, being able to the level of scale is that, well, if every part of a human being is a tensegrity, then just being able to reach into a puppet where, in the back, you don't necessarily have to put some skin, then there can almost be no interface, is that you can sort of just be one with your connection. And then in terms of speed of reaction and sort of aliveness, sort of the dream would be to have like no separation between you and the object. I don't know if that relates.
No, that's great. And I remember when we had Eleanor Ori Echo on the Tea Party, and you know, she's a biologist doing research at the cellular level, but she's also an aerialist. And she was talking about how when you're hanging from the trapeze, where is ground? The ground is up, right? Because it's up through the ropes into whatever is, you know, the trapeze is hanging from, and then that gets you to ground. So this whole interface concept is bringing me to lots of fun places. We need last comments, I think, because we need to be finishing up. We're a little over time. Any last questions? Hey, Jan. Jan's jumping in. You'll catch it on YouTube. It'll be wonderful.
I've been here for a while, but it sounded so great. I'm going to go back and watch it all again.
What about Brad? Did you have anything? I know you've been doing a lot of work with Mariana on a lot of this.
Yeah,
But I know you're also.
I'm not sure if she's there.
Yeah.
But I can't. I want to see now what's going to happen with the ultrasound following this line of, you know, thoughts.
Can you talk briefly about what you've been doing collaborating with Brad, Mariana?
Sure. Yes, we are helping a girl from his area with prolotherapy, and somehow I'm helping with the assessment what to do with the treatment. So it's been very interesting. This is like a lot of. Oh, there he is. Hi, Brad.
Right. So taking the work that you do with the CP kids and then working with Brad and prolotherapy and the work he does to see, well, Brad, did you want to say?
Well, are you able to hear me?
Yes.
I can't see myself, so I don't
We
know
can see you, we can hear you.
Okay, good. So my work is in stimulating repair and connective tissue. So I'm trying to reestablish tensional forces where they've been compromised. So I'm trying to understand what Leonid and Mariana are doing, and also showing them what I see on ultrasound. So with this particular child, she had multiple surgeries, dorsal rhizotomy, which involved a large incision through the fascia of her thoracolumbar region, and then 2 hip surgeries with large scars. So we looked at how well that hip tissue healed underneath using ultrasound, and then we used injection into those tissues to stimulate repair. And then using Leonid's and Mariana's techniques since we did that first treatment, which I'm very anxious to hear about tomorrow, what they've been doing and trying to understand how that interacts with the body's activation of fibroblasts from the prolo, and to reestablish more uniformity of forces rather than that collapse.
What I feel is very interesting, and again, I love the emerging properties of all these meetings. I can visualize comparing, because it was very clear in the ultrasound how the connections were lost. Mm-hmm. So if you go back to the skin, like you could see that wasn't connected the way it should, right? So I think using all this knowledge from now, considering the skin and how deep the skin is, that could be seen in an ultrasound. Mm-hmm. So I'm interested, like that. Yeah, there are many things that can come out of this conversation.
Yeah, well, that's exactly the point, you know, guys. That this is really, it's just, you know, look, the message of this conversation is actually very, very simple. Is that due to some tradition, we have been locked into this kind of fast forwarding, which obviously cuts away not just from specific therapies, but very much from everything that we observe and that we try to kind of see in humans, how we categorize different conditions, how we categorize what is, what is better and what is worse, right? So you see, and what do we want to do, what factors matter and what factors don't. So, and of course, in that respect, like whatever dimension you take, there is something to be found and explored. And on the good side, as I said, is that finally, like there is this new like logic of the sciences like peridynamics, the science of cracks and so on, which is very helpful to fill those things in mathematically, because that gives us the ability to interpret the interfaces, interpret the discontinuities, right? Because otherwise, see the conundrum. The conundrum is that discontinuities of the compressions within the tensegrity, they in itself create the whole problem, because if you're dealing if your mathematical tools are continuum mechanics, which want the compressions to be continuous, and you declare, okay, I'm going to study them in a discontinuous fashion, you got the trouble. So suddenly, you are stepping out of the sort of even not just established domains, but you're stepping out of their kind of being officially scientific at all, right? Altogether. So that's why these new bridges which are brought, they are very helpful in like tangibilizing, right? And that's the way that I have always seen it, is that biotensegrity is sort of has the compact folded versions of all these potential behaviors that come around and happen at the cracks. But it's like you have this very compacted version of the standard mechanics, then you have a very compacted version of the tensegrity, but then you've got this whole family of the processes and the irregularities that happen in between. And the more we appreciate those irregularities, the more we appreciate how like complex we are, the more we become aware of what is kind of habitually skipped in the standard anatomy. Then suddenly you kind of start asking these questions, like the famous story about the king's new dress or whatever, right? So that
the emperor's new clothes.
Yeah, the emperor's new clothes. Yeah, that's it. So where you see that basically the biomechanics is missing the clothes altogether, right? Skinless biomechanics, so that's missing the clothes altogether and tries to make an important face out of it.
That might be a great note to end on. I want to
so the closing toast, right?
Yes.
Closing toast. Mm-hmm.
So I guess for the closing toast, we will still move to their observation of their reality, right? So you see, unfiltered being brave enough to meet the unfiltered reality first, right? And also being brave enough to venture into the intellectual pastures, which do not seem that familiar to begin with, but then suddenly give us their new and exciting understandings.
Yes.
L'chaim.
Yes.
Party.
Okay.